I'm here from Newcastle University, and I want to talk to you about both web science and human-computer interaction. This is a piece of work that I did in conjunction with Alan Dix, to whom we shall return shortly. The motivation is that there are a lot of parallels between these two fields. They are both radically interdisciplinary, and they both involve looking at the intersection between people and society. What we wanted to do was to explore the way in which they relate, shared strengths, opportunities for collaboration and mutual benefit. So what I'm going to do is very briefly take you through how we conceptualize both WebSci and HCI, and then we're going to go through how they overlap in terms of their content, their scope, and their subject matter, and their methods. And then we're going to talk about some lessons for the web science community from HCI. So without further ado, if you are in this room, I really hope you have an idea of what web science is, but just to go through this, web science is about looking at the impact of the web upon society and vice versa as well, okay? It's about understanding those emergent macro properties from these socio-technical interactions. And importantly, it's about the web as an unfolding process rather than as a static object. Why do we do web science? Well, it's about both understanding but also impacting the web. So we've been working in areas that cover and can influence stuff such as government policy, technical infrastructure, and so forth. There are various angles in on how we might look at web science as a structure. So the first starting point might be the subject categorization. This is the very top level of what you can find on the Web Science Trust pages. And as anyone who ran into me last night will also know, there is Nigel's infamous cluster diagram or butterfly diagram of the disciplines involved in web science. And indeed, we've started to do a little bit of empirical work looking at the actual levels of representation from different disciplines. So there's a lot of lenses through which we can understand how we go about web science and what web science means. Let's talk about human-computer interaction. So HCI is the study of the issues which arise when people interact with technology. And it is also a design discipline, looking at how to build better technology. As I say, like web science, this is very much an interdisciplinary field. And indeed, this list of disciplines is directly taken from this book here, which, by the way, Alan wrote. So in terms of HCI expertise in this paper, we have a lot of it. In this book on human-computer interaction, the ideal HCI practitioner was, in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way, described as having expertise from these different disciplines. So we can begin to see some parallels arising. And indeed, taking a little bit of inspiration from the cluster diagram, you can start to think about other areas, other disciplines that contribute to HCI that you might not see in web science. So things like ergonomics, like management and information sciences. And one last bit about HCI was, this was a first impression about perhaps an HCI heat map, if you will. I should say that the first heat map I showed you about web science was empirically generated, whereas this was more of a thought experiment. So take those two diagrams in their respective contexts. But hopefully you're beginning to get a bit of an idea here about how the two disciplines align and what they've got going on. Subject matter, then. I would like to talk about Ben Schneiderman. So he is involved in the web science community. I think he might even be in the Web Science Trust. I'm not quite sure about that. But he's involved with website, but he is primarily someone who works in HCI. And he wrote an excellent article in ACM Interactions late on last year, where he talked, among other things, about the scope of HCI in terms of how it influences commercial success, reforms education, has the potential to change family life, and affects political stability. These are quite broad statements that are being made here. So what we could say is that perhaps, well, HCI involves designing and evaluating certain artifacts, and some of those are on the web, and web science involves studying those artifacts, right? Of course, it is much more complicated than that. But as a first initial insight, this is one stance you could take. And although it is more complicated than that, there are some insights we can get just from this initial stance. So what we have here is a few opportunities in terms of web science techniques offer an opportunity perhaps for HCI practitioners to understand the impact of artifacts and interactions that are happening in a web context. And conversely, there are areas of expertise in HCI that can be a service to the web science community. So a big example is there's a large field, a large set of people working on understanding user experiences, which is something that could most certainly be relevant in web science work. To talk about scope, you could say that web science involves looking at the web, and HCI involves looking at technology. So web science is surely a subset of HCI, right? No, clearly not the case. But So what we have here is clear areas where they don't overlap. So for example, in HCI, if you're talking about individual level offline interactions, about ergonomics, about the time taken to press a button or something like that, none of that's web science. And conversely though, in web science, if you're studying things like the philosophy of the web politics, legal aspects online, that's not HCI either. However, there is a ton of stuff that does overlap. So for example, things like culturally adaptive interfaces, Web 2.0 learning, user experiences online that I just touched upon. So to be a bit more nuanced, I would like to return to Ben Schneiderman. So that article I just touched on was primarily proposing the concept of macro and micro HCI. So he was conceptualizing HCI as falling into these two halves, if you will. And the idea is that in micro HCI, practitioners and academics tend to focus much more on accounting for individual variations, looking at things like how you would deal with or account for gender, literacy, motivation, disability, that kind of thing, and studying how that affects your interactions with a single interface. Whereas macro HCI is looking much more at experience. It's talking about things like community, art, wellness, politics. So, in terms of content, what we can see is a fairly clear overlap between macro HCI and web science. And particularly so, we see micro HCI looking very much at individual level things, macro HCI moving up to more social group level interactions, looking at communities. And that's where we see some web science, and then we see more web science higher up in this graph, where we're talking about lumpen interactions, and that's referring to where you're running studies looking at massive social networks and really large scale effects. We can also talk about methodology. So I'm not going to give you a history of HCI, but HCI is currently in what's commonly called the third wave, and the focus in that is about understanding people and affect. It's about looking at socio-technical factors and sense-making. And so once again, to return to Interactions magazine, there was one of the cover articles on it last year was by a chap called Bannon, and he was calling for a human-centered perspective in HCI. And among other things in his article, what he remarked was this. He said, this panel P, talking about HCI, of ideas, critiques, art, designs, and reflections, at times sits uneasily with a scientific research agenda. There is something about the kind of questions that are being asked, being raised, that makes us realize that this mixing of scientific knowledge on the one hand and design expertise on the other make for uneasy bedfellows. Does this sound familiar? Because it really, really should. Okay? So there's similar issues going on right now, in fact. The HCI community goes back decades, but right now these are discussions that are going on there. There's stuff we can learn here. So thinking about methodological stances, we can start to think about what happens in the context of HCI, where on the one hand you have more positivist type work in micro HCI, and you have much more interpretivist, qualitative work going on in macro HCI. In micro HCI you tend to see many more things such as measurements and log analysis, task timings, this sort of stuff. In terms of, what's happened there? I'm sorry? Oh, okay, thanks. Cool. So, yeah, whereas macro HCI is much more encompassing and much more interpretivistic in its approaches. So, what we could look at is the idea of, although macro HCI and website have a lot in common in terms of their content, in terms of methods, we do see a lot of sort of network science type approaches in web science. And we see things such as even the phrase social machines kind of comes much more from the sort of a positivist stance when you think about those particular words. So there's some interesting dynamics going on here, because in terms of methods, you could certainly say a lot of HCI is much more at the micro, a lot of web science at the micro HCI end of things. With me so far? Good. So, having gone through this set of positioning, we have 4 particular lessons that I would like to take you through. And the first is about divergence, and it's about this stuff I was just saying about these 2 different stances when you're going about research. Now, Ben Schneiderman, in his article on macro and micro HCI, treats them very much as complementary things, and it's the case that strong work in the HCI community draws on both of those and combines them, okay? But certainly in the HCI community, there is frequently, sad to say, a division between the interpretivist and the positivist stances. And I don't think we do that too badly anyway. I think that as a community, we are pretty good at acknowledging the differences in these worldviews. I'm interested as to how conversations go at the end of this talk. I really want opinions from you guys, so I hope you're going to come at me with some. But I think perhaps because we're a much smaller community than HCI, and we're a much younger community, and both of those things mean we are able to have a dialogue, and we do have a dialogue about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and that's important. That's absolutely key for this kind of stuff. So I would say we don't do too badly at this stuff, but we need to keep working on maintaining it, and I'm going to come back to that, and I'm going to repeat that. Also, it's really important that we do acknowledge the differences. So what I am not saying is, well, there's these two different stances and these two different approaches, and we take them both and it's great and it's wonderful. It's absolutely vital that we are aware that these are really different worldviews and that they are sometimes conflicting worldviews. And that's okay. But it's really, really key that when we go about interdisciplinary work, we have conversations. We do not assume when we pick up a method from one discipline that it's going to be able to be just applied in the new context, which is very easily done. So this is why I'm making these points. And indeed, talking about methods specifically, both HCI and web science have got a ton of subdisciplines. We've seen that. And each of those does have its own set of methods, its own language, and its own set of assumptions. So the key message here is we really do need to be aware. So for example, if someone was talking about, I don't know, picking up actor network theory and applying it as a designer in some particular context, if there's not someone who comes from a sociology background, that's the time when you need to really start asking questions about what's going on and why. Okay? Also, here's a shout out. So one of the things that I've been really impressed with in the website community is when I have seen web science students, PhD students, each student has a couple of supervisors, and those supervisors are from different disciplines. Really, this is exemplary. This is a really excellent approach, and my impression is the work that those guys are churning out is really, really top-notch web science. Those students and their supervisors, and if you're not in the room, but you know them, talk to them from me, I want to hear from you guys. We should have a paper at Web Science next year about how this works as a process, because this is a really awesome approach, and it's not a trivial thing, it's not necessarily the most straightforward thing. A contribution there about the stumbling blocks, about what worked well, about how to go about this would be, I feel, extremely welcome. So let's have that conversation. The third lesson is about evaluation, okay? So in HCI, evaluation does indeed span both objective and subjective areas, okay? Now, there are parts of HCI in which evaluation is really, really tough. So examples include exploratory search and visualization, along with really broader areas, and I'm going to come back to this, such as looking at experience and looking at leisure. Now, in 2007, to return to our friend Ben Schneiderman, his ears must be burning wherever he is right now, he wrote an article in Communications of the ACM. And this was fairly early in the days of web science, and what he was saying was, all right, so here's computer science, here's web science. How is web science going to compare? How is it going to be different? And he started to take some quantitative metrics from CompSci and talk about, well, what might this look like in WebSci? So he talks about going from Moore's law to page views, from computer networks to social networks, and so forth. All right. So that was one stance that was 5 years ago. And that's talking about quantitative metrics. More recently, Schneiderman has been talking about qualitative metrics in HCI. So, was it? Yeah, it was the same article, the macro and micro HCI article, was calling for qualitative metrics such as gigahellos and telecontrips. So what he was saying is we need to be able in HCI to measure these things and to understand their impact, right? You can't engineer for something if you don't understand where it's coming from. In the same way, we need to think about this from a web science context. So we need to have a conversation. First of all, returning to this concept of quantitative metrics, because this is a great start, but this was from 2007, and I'm not convinced there's been a real conversation since then. And I don't think there's been any conversation about qualitative metrics in WebSci. We need to begin to have a conversation about what are the key and core metrics and methods and approaches in web science. And that's something we need to do as a community. So the final of these lessons is about the sort of the focus, the direction. So to start off by talking about HCI, HCI has always been a dual discipline. I touched on this when I first introduced it, right? It's the academic study of interactions between people and technology, but it's also a design discipline about how you build build for those interactions and how you make them better in some way or another. And as a consequence of that duality, there's always been a thread of conversations within HCI about, is this a craft? Is this engineering? Is it science? What are we doing? You know, how do we view ourselves and how do we work together? Now, web science is called web science, yeah? We've got that word in the name of the discipline, which is interesting in and of itself. But in the same way as in computer science, what we see is both analysis and synthesis as well. And that's something that's reflected in web science. So we're looking at both understanding, but also feeding back that understanding into all things that are going on in the web. Yeah, okay. So there are some questions that we need to ask, though, mirroring the HCI questions of how do we bring these threads together? How would it look if, for example, design and network science start working together? What's that collaboration going to look like? How is it going to work? And how is it going to fit with the broader scope of web science? We need to have conversations about how to get over these very different approaches. And that's talking both about, so this links in with the second method about the second lesson about methods, right? So you've got the quantitative and the qualitative approaches, but at the same time, this is sort of a separate thing about, well, what is it like is it the same to design in web science as it is to study in web science? How do these things work? And yeah, that was the final point on this particular one. In HCI, so HCI is a big discipline and it's an old discipline and it has a whole raft of different models, frameworks, principles, and so forth, both within the academic community and available to practitioners in the field. So how's that going to work in web science? Yeah, what is a web science metric going to look like? What is a web science best practice guide? So I've raised a lot of questions, and I think there's a lot of conversations that we need to be having and engaging in. And there is stuff in the HCI community that we can draw from because we share certain goals and we share certain challenges with them. Again, I would say we have a cohesive and a reasonably balanced community. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. We're having conversations about keeping that balance, and that itself is important. It's half the battle. But we need to keep going. It's too easy to sit back and say, yeah, we've had a conversation, we've done it, it's fine, we're all in the same room. And that's not enough. We really need to keep talking about this stuff. These are the questions that I think we need to be talking about. So we need to be looking in web science in general. Where have misunderstandings happened? What have been the stumbling blocks? What have, conversely, have been the sources of really, really strong work? What has inspired people, and how did that come about? And particularly, I feel really, really strongly about these last two things. It is really important that we talk about what are the central methods in web science? What is a web science method? And how are we going to make that available to people? How are students going to learn about these things? And furthermore, how do we apply web science in practice? If you're taking web science out of a lecture theatre and out into the field, how does that look? And how does that look in different contexts? Because it's very different to talk about web science, say, in a government context, as in, say, small and medium businesses. So these are conversations we need to have. And the reason I'm making these points is there is so much potential in the work we are doing. We are doing really exciting and really cool stuff in this community. And it has impacts in all these different areas that I've been touching on through this entire talk. And there is so much more to gain by working under the broader umbrella than by splitting into the sub-communities that were there before we made web science.